Ahoy hoy gang! If this is your first time with us, welcome! And if you're coming from a previous video, hey, we love to see it and I'm glad to have you back. Here we are, the start of a brand new series retrospective. I know sometimes my intros for these retrospectives can be a little long, so I've gone ahead and put a timestamp to just skip to the episode reviews if that's what you're looking for. I promise there's some good stuff in the intro, but hey, I totally get it. So all you propaniacs, it's time to head on down to Arlen and meet one wild neighborhood. If there were a Mount Rushmore of adult animation, it would probably include people like Seth MacFarlane, Matt Groening, Trey Parker, Matt Stone, and of course, Mike Judge. Who, oh my god, the man has lived a very storied life. Dude was the son of an archaeologist, was in a blues band, worked in Silicon Valley, and then just went on to have one of the largest impacts on pop culture of the modern era. See, back in the 1990s, MTV was one of the biggest paragons of pop culture. It was a melting pot of all kinds of experimental media, and while shocking to most, I swear it's true, actually played music videos instead of episodes of Catfish. Neve could never. While Mike Judge was working on his own animations as an indie developer, there was a series on MTV called Liquid Television that would air shorts by independent creators, and if they did well enough, hey, you got your own show order. Judge submitted Frog Baseball in 1992 that featured two of the dumbest characters ever created, Beavis and Butthead. He also made a collection of shorts about a character named Milton that would later get turned into the 1999 movie Office Space, which is absolutely amazing and cements Gary Cole and Stephen Root as comedy legends. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Beavis and Butthead were huge. Sure, Aeon Flux also came out of Liquid Television and was awesome, but nothing quite had the pop cultural impact that Beavis and Butthead had. Beavis and Butthead were cornerstones of MTV, one of the most watched cable channels, and helped catapult adult animation on cable TV by and far. It cannot be understood that there's a very good chance Viacom only took a chance on South Park that Fox had already passed on at that point because they had had such success with Beavis and Butthead. Beavis and Butthead got a movie in 1996 and is actually free on YouTube as I'm typing this. That very movie starred 90s legends Bruce Willis and Demi Moore, who at the time were married. This show about two idiots led to a movie that was an absolute chart topper that made its budget back and then some, which was absolutely unheard of for an adult animated property in the 90s. It would also get a spinoff in the form of Daria, created by Glenn Eichler and Susie Lewis-Lynn, without Mike Judge attached. And why? Well, he was working on a little show set in Arlen, Texas. King of the Hill was picked up by Fox, and while they thought it had some charm, they were worried about the characters seeming too country. And so they brought in Greg Daniels of Simpsons fame to help polish up the series, and what we got after that was 13 seasons of, shaky quality. So how did a 13-season show from 1997 that's been over since 2009 manage to maintain its popularity to this day? Short answer, syndication. You can probably find a King of the Hill rerun airing on some channel at any given time, even in the middle of the day. It's just always on. And the reason it's always on is because at its core, King of the Hill represents something more than the sum of its parts. It's like a modern version of Norman Rockwell paintings, just without a celebration of American culture, music, and the true form of the American spirit. So how did King of the Hill become such a cultural phenomena? Well, there's really only one way to find out, isn't there? From the Fox to the syndication era, here is King of the Hill in review. And here we are, Season 1. It's my first Season 1 in a minute, so you'll have to excuse me for any rust on the old gears. I've gotten some flack in the past for saying a show is a product of its time, but I think it's most appropriate with King of the Hill. Remember, this series came out in 1997, and it shows. Not in any drastic ways, but you're going to see the Hills adapt to things like cell phones and home internet, and even fear the big bad boogeyman that was Y2K, which wouldn't even rear its digital head for another few seasons. Plural. So yeah, it literally is from a different millennia, and some episodes have understandably aged better than others. Full disclosure, while I've watched the show my entire life and know most of the episodes by memory, I've never done an episode-by-episode rewatch starting in Season 1. So in a lot of ways, we'll be experiencing it together for the first time. Season 1 is a crisp 12-episode order, which really isn't uncommon with animated series. American Dad, Bob's Burgers, Family Guy, and Futurama all had short first seasons because the studio doesn't want to bank an entire 22-episode year-long commitment if the series doesn't do well. While it may air for 6 months, usually they'll repeat the season to fill in for things until we get back to sweeps. However, there's a lot to love about the first season, and it starts laying the groundwork for the characters and dynamics that would still resonate over 20 years later. So, what worked? What failed? What ideas of a charcoal-based future will need to be curtailed? There's only one way to find out, and only one way it can be done. Here we go, reviewing Season 1! It's a pilot. I mean, that's all I really got for you. It is the roughest the show is going to look and the roughest the characters are going to sound and seem. That is it. Remember, this is effectively a proof of concept. That being said, it's actually really cool looking at the background shots because a lot of them look to be made with stencils and watercolor. Some very rudimentary designs at that. And you have to remember, this is back when the majority of shows were still hand-drawn cell by cell. Obviously, there was a switch to digital production later in the show, but every frame needed to serve a purpose, and you can actually see the frames cut. I'm obviously not going to tear it apart because of this, since it's literally because of techniques of the time period, but it really is something fascinating to see. Honestly, for that reason alone, the pilot is a must-watch episode. Anyway, pilot opens with Hank and friends looking at his truck to figure out what's wrong with it, with a trusty, refreshing Alamo beer in each of their hands. Bill, voiced by comedy legend Stephen Root, who you have heard in countless animated series and has starred in everything from Office Space to Barry and everything in between. Dale is played by the late great Johnny Hardwick, who sadly passed before I began this review, and before he was able to record all of his lines for the revival series in the works. He hadn't worked in voice acting prior to Mike Judge recruiting him, and honestly you can hear his evolution as a voice actor in real time, which is downright magical. Hank and Boomhauer are voiced by Mike Judge and would be for the duration of the show. Hank starts out sounding like a carbon copy of Tom Anderson from Beavis and Butthead, in large part because they were based off the same real person from Mike Judge's childhood, and they had planned to have them be related, though unfortunately had to scrap the idea, instead giving us the timeless classic of a dad, Cotton Hill, who, I don't know if you know this or not, but he killed 50 men. These four would go on to be your guiding star of the series. Their families may be featured, they may not be, but for all intents and purposes, these are your core four. They're just four guys standing around looking at a truck, sipping beer, and talking about the latest episode of Seinfeld. They're not complex, and they don't need to be. We then get the intro by the Refreshments, which I'm sure you can hear just from thinking it. It's okay, I do it too, but it just speaks to how iconic the theme is. These cold opens would be common for the early seasons and would eventually be phased out, but honestly, I miss them when they're not there. They're great. Anyway, we meet Bobby, Hank's son, played by Pamela Adlon, listening to a prankster cassette on his Walkman. Google it. Luann, Hank's, I guess, niece-in-law? She's Peggy's niece, and she lives with him. Played by the incredibly talented and always missed Brittany Murphy. Seriously, watch Ramen Girl. It's great. Toshiyuki Nishida was also just brilliant in the movie. It is a very good movie that needs more attention. And, of course, Peggy Hill, played by Kathy Najimy, who is still coming into her own with the character, but you can tell she is gunning for it. She is putting in the effort. The episode focuses around Bobby being bad at sports, playing baseball, getting beaned, and when Hank goes into Megalomart, a giant big box store like the then surging in popularity Walmart, to get some WD-40, he yells at the incompetent retail worker that doesn't even know where to find a hammer. It is the first appearance of Buckley's model, but he doesn't have the characteristics of Buckley just yet, other than being really, really dumb. Anyway, a bunch of no-named women start gossiping about Hank losing his cool and Bobby's black eye, and next thing you know, CPS gets called on him. That's the pilot here. CPS goes to the Hill House. Isn't that funny? We also see Dale getting all conspiratorial like we love to see. There's even a global warming joke that has not aged well. It's really funny they bring up global warming, though, because it wouldn't be largely discussed in pop culture until Al Gore would release An Inconvenient Truth in 2006, and it's definitely a showing of Mike Judge's more political-focused dialogue. Remember, conventional home internet wasn't a thing. AM talk radio was still a way a lot of people got their news from day to day. Anyway, the CPS worker does interviews, and this is when we see that Hank is passionate, he's patriotic, but he's not violent unless he is truly pushed. Compare this to the other huge Fox animated series of the time, where it took them 31 seasons to have people start wondering if Homer was going to stop strangling Bart, and they went back and said no. It gives you something to stand behind. This is Hank Hill, a salt-of-the-earth propane and propane accessory salesman. He's a man that follows his own moral code and respects anyone that works hard and tries to be the best person they can be. None of the characters in this series are really shooting for greatness. Hank doesn't have larger aspirations. He has dreams, sure, but he's not actively pursuing them because he believes they're out of his reach. Bill is a military barber. Dale is an exterminator. We don't know what Boomhauer does, don't think about it. Hank sells propane for his pseudo-father figure Buck Strickland, aka the best character in the show, spoilers, and they're just trying to raise their families and provide the best ways they know how. We're introduced to Dale's wife, Nancy, played by Ashley Gardner, and her headache healing specialist, John Redcorn, who Dale's son looks a lot alike. Don't question it. Anyway, CPS calls off the investigation and tells Bobby, who decides to not tell Hank so that he can't yell at him or be mad because he thinks when he's mad, he doesn't love him. Peggy insists that Hank tells Bobby that he loves him unconditionally because he genuinely does. This is the first time we see Hank's past in our first introduction to Cotton, played by General Tracer himself, Toby Huss. And so yeah, Hank is stunted emotionally and doesn't know how to communicate with his son. Something new and unique for cartoon dads. However, he tells his son he's proud of him and they shadowbox on the porch and laugh as the episode pans out. I would love to see what the pilot looked like before Greg Daniels looked it over, because I feel like it would have been a vastly different show. Even from the first episode, you pan away with your heart full and an appreciation for these characters. I'm not gonna lie, I teared up a little watching the pilot. That's what King of the Hill does to you. It knows how to evoke raw emotion from things you wouldn't think about, in large part due to how human it is. Hank isn't a CIA agent. There's no talking dogs or aliens, despite what Dale thinks, and for all intents and purposes, everything in the show is believable. You could have made King of the Hill as a live-action series. Would it be as good? Absolutely not, but it could have been done. The pilot is a solid 10 out of 10 that may be a product of its time, but it's still a great product to appreciate. I liken King of the Hill to Norman Rockwell, but it may be better to call it a New Age Andy Griffith show. There's a genuine heart at its core that just didn't exist in animation at the time, or really afterwards. How do you capture that down-home energy twice? Bobby has to get a permission slip signed by Peggy and Hank so he can get a sex ed course in the 8th grade, and Peggy and Hank, while hesitant, believe he should be taught sex ed at home. Huh. That sure is topical for a series that came out 25 years ago. Hank believes the government should be kept out of his bedroom and people should just be allowed to be. Wow, that seems like a reasonable and nuanced take that is a surprisingly charged one 25 years after he's uttering it. Seems odd to me, all I'm saying. Oh look, after Hank attempts to teach Bobby himself with the help of a woman using a bovine inseminator, which is surprisingly progressive for 97, you love to see it, he and Peggy trust the trained official to talk to their son about a sensitive subject and get the appropriate information he needs. Well, Dale decides to send a funny little threat to the teacher, who quits and they need a substitute. A substitute teacher of the year of 1996. One Peggy Hill. I'm telling you, we don't appreciate backgrounds anymore. Sure, yeah, fine, the animation is choppy in parts, but those backgrounds are gorgeous. And so, yeah, Peggy has to grapple with having shame and the common decency while trying to be honest about what she's teaching the kids in sex ed and making sure they're getting a proper lesson that is more substantial than what she got. This is the second episode and we're already tackling plots like this. Will they all be like this? No, absolutely not. But man, talk about masterful storytelling to navigate it so deftly. Also, for Peggy's first episode to be the second episode is something great. It really gives Kathy Najimy a time to shine and really put some effort into Peggy and some emotion. And honestly, if she was even a fraction less talented, Peggy would not be nearly as good. Sure, a lot of people justifiably hate Peggy for later seasons, and I don't blame them, but it's definitely not because Kathy Najimy slipped up. She brings 112% every single episode. Like, the episode comes down to Peggy not wanting to be repressed and to give Bobby a healthy sex ed so he knows what to expect as he grows into being an adult, and Hank challenging change, ultimately forbidding Bobby to go to school and taking him to work instead. And it's at this point that King of the Hill transcends other animated series. When Bobby starts asking questions, Hank admits that Peggy is a courageous and strong woman for being willing to teach the kids about sex ed, and even takes Bobby back to learn from her since she's been studying it. He could have bashed her, he could have ignored and blown her off the entire episode, but even in his most repressed ways, he genuinely cares about Peggy and thinks the world of her. Hank loves his family. He's not the best at showing it, but it is never questioned if he does or doesn't. This is the second episode, and it shows Hank not only being wrong, but admitting to being wrong and trying to put some respect on his wife's name to a bunch of kids that ultimately don't even take the course because it's optional and needs parental permission, showing that it was never that deep to begin with. Like, how do you marry political commentary with genuine emotional development so expertly? You tell me what political leaning this episode has. Peggy is a trained educator who studied and prepared herself to give a mature conversation about sex ed to children in a classroom, but only if their parents provided consent. You point out to me the slant one way or another. It tackles the topic in a logical way while showing the reasons why people may think like they do. It never uniformly attacks the people of Arlen or makes them seem idiotic. Dale being weird yet dumb actually gives his character some depth that'll be explored later on. Square Peg is another terrific episode that builds out what's coming and is a great step in establishing Peggy as a character who will totally not be ruined later on. Square Peg is another really solid 10 out of 10. It's the Order of the Straight Arrow, and we get to see Hank and the gang going on a snipe hunt and get drunk off non-alcoholic Bloody Mary mix when they're kids. I actually appreciate that the gang's dads, except for Cotton, were actually different and get established later on. I didn't talk about Peggy's mom in the last episode because it really just doesn't matter. She's gonna change a lot more as the series goes on. So yeah, Hank is taking Bobby up to do the Order of the Straight Arrow, like a Boy Scout thing, and we get John Redcorn, who's actually played by Victor Aaron in this episode, though he tragically passed before the episode aired. The episode would be dedicated to his memory, and he would play him for the rest of the season, and he'd be replaced by Jonathan Joss from Season 2 on. Peggy gives Luann and Hank fun savers, which are little disposable cameras, which, look, technology evolved really, really quickly, okay? Different times. Anyway, she rushes them out to get a weekend to herself, which is a wild adventure. And so yeah, it's a Hank and the Gang episode where they take the boys up and share the park with a bunch of protesters. Hank and the gang repurpose the spiritual stuff John Redcorn taught them to spice up their straight arrow rituals, and the kids understandably believe everything they say. So when it comes time for the snipe hunt and Bobby runs out and actually gets a snipe with his whoop-ass stick, greatest line ever, Hank is confused until he opens his bag and discovers he's bludgeoned an endangered whooping crane by mistake. The gang try to bury or hide the bird so they don't get caught, while Bobby tries to show the animal respect and reverence because he believed everything his dad was telling him, even as Hank is trying to lie to a park ranger and slip past. And when all hope seems lost and Bobby puts the bird in the water for one last blessing, it wakes up and flies off. Which, okay. The crane is a very spiritual bird inherently. There's an episode later on in the series that you could argue that this foreshadows. But you could also just as easily go, oh, it was just stunned and woke up and that's that. I don't know. Seems curious. Just saying Bobby might be a kind of messiah. Oh, and Peggy sneaking around was because she shops at a shoe store for women with larger feet, and she does it in secret because she's embarrassed by it. An entire B story that was believable back in 1997, and almost unfathomable in 2023 since you could just order shoes online, like with today's sponsor. I have no sponsors. Oh. No, the Order of the Straight Arrow is terrific, and is another great mix of, again, family and political commentary. The environmentalists running through nests to punish Hank for the crane, juxtaposed with Hank realizing that he was instilling in Bobby the same trauma his dad instilled in him, and taught him an us versus them mentality when Bobby should know his dad is always going to support him no matter what. These things are both handled with an equal amount of weight, until understandably the Bobby Hank story is the more important one. I think the most important thing about these life lessons at the end of the episode is they're not given by some sage figure to Hank. Hank just sort of figures it out on his own. Hank is not a perfect person, but he loves his family, and even though he may not outwardly show it, he loves Bobby more than anything. That is his son. This is episode 3, and if I had to boil down the appeal of this episode to one solitary scene, it would be when the crane wakes up, spreads its wings against the sun, and flies off. If that's not the most Hayao Miyazaki shot you've ever seen. But in all seriousness, it wasn't something you saw in adult animation at the time. It didn't linger on shots or have shots that appreciate the beauty of nature. It's jumping from one joke to the next as jaggedly as possible. But King of the Hill never really does that. It never tries to pull you along to a different joke. I don't know. The Order of the Straight Arrow is not an episode you'd expect out of any show's third episode, much less an adult animated series. It's yet another 10 out of 10 that shows what captivated America about King of the Hill. We get to see Hank's perfect dream. He's playing golf and then playing guitar with music icon Willie Nelson, played by Willie Nelson, the first major guest star of the show. Dennis Hopper would later appear in the same episode, played by himself. That's right, Bowser in that Mario movie. And Speed! Anyway, Bobby starts playing Betsy, Hank's beloved guitar, with a block of cheese like his comedy icon Celery Head and his pun of Eddie Cheddar, which, you know what? Respect for them just telling the joke and not actually showing Pearl Jam playing with cheese. Hank is upset that Bobby doesn't have any heroes like he does with Willie Nelson, and he's determined to make sure Bobby finds a real hero to look up to. So he and the gang take him golfing, where he actually seems to do pretty good, until he accidentally hits a fellow golfer, Willie Nelson, who proceeds to black out. Hank's only interaction with Willie Nelson is to help a concussed man along. Bobby decides to help his dad out to show that he's a good son, and goes to Willie Nelson's with Hank's beloved Betsy, which he then signs and invites Hank and Peggy to come hang out with other celebrities and party at his barbecue. Oh, right, and then Hank, blows up his trailer or something, right? Nope. They go and have a great time at Willie Nelson's, and Hank gets to perform with his hero. And the great part about this episode is that it has a B story that's so carefully interwoven into the A story that they need to exist together. Peggy hates how much Hank loves his guitar. He puts it before her a lot of the time, which justifiably makes her upset. She has to strap his guitar in and treat it like a precious gem, even as he admits he loves it and can't admit to loving her the same. Seems pretty horrible, right? Well, hang on now. We also get to see that Peggy is a softball throwing machine that puts so much heat in her throws, even Luann needs a second when she's catching for her. There's so many small things that just keep elevating Peggy as a character. And then by the end of the episode, when you genuinely feel for Peggy and feel like her rage is justified, you hear Hank singing in his own awkward way about how much he loves his peg leg, his Peggy. He loves that guitar because it lets him express himself. And while he could never personally say those things to her, he feels safer to express himself with his guitar. And that's not even me reading into it. It's shown to you throughout the episode. If Peter gets a guitar, he's singing about Iraq lobsters or butter on Pop-Tarts. If Homer gets a guitar, it's probably to reference a punk band of the current decade. But if Hank gets it, he just plays alongside his hero and sings about how much he loves his wife. Even if we go back to the dream sequence, he's not with another woman, he's not wishing he had a better family, he has a personal dream of wanting to play golf with Willie Nelson. He doesn't want to change his home life, because he loves his home life. It's the first and one of the few times we see Hank have solid aspirations. Sure, he's an assistant manager at Strickland Propane, but he's also a man that loves music, and it's just so incredible to see so much development in just the first season. Hank's Got the Willies is just another mind-blowing 10 out of 10. Luann is stoked to move out of Hank's den and move in with Buckley, her boyfriend, who unceremoniously dumps her instead of having her move in. This is actually our first episode without a cold open, and I just want you to appreciate the age in the opening scene. Luann and Peggy are doing a workout tape, while Bobby complains that his Game Boy is out of batteries. Feel old yet? I remember having those problems. And so yeah, Peggy is right there for her niece to help her get through her devastating breakup, while Hank is trying to just get through his day, while struggling to take any of Peggy's advice to help. Now, it's at this juncture where I need to thank you all for watching and for me to come clean with a terrible secret of mine. I have always meant for this channel to be an escape for people, for them to not worry about anything and just enjoy themselves. Even in my comments, I make sure to try and respond to each of you in some way so people feel seen and appreciated, because you are. I have tried to cultivate a place of no judgment, so none of you can judge me. It's foreboding. I had no idea Chuck Mangione was a real person until I was well into my 20s. Yeah, we get our first appearance of Megalomart's spokesperson, and apparently real person Chuck Mangione, played by Chuck Mangione, the actual real one. His albums look the same and everything. I just never bothered to Google it or look into it, thought they were mocking like Kenny G. Nope, totally real guy. Tangent aside, Hank actually starts hanging out with Luann and bonding as he helps her get over Buckley, and then decides he's going to help her find a real boyfriend so she can still move out and he can still get his den back, all while Peggy is following a bunch of rules to make sure the breakup goes as smoothly as possible, even making sure she doesn't pick up a rebound relationship, which, I'm gonna say it, Peggy in just the first season alone has so much agency, it's insane. She's not afraid to speak up and stand for what she thinks is right, loves her family, and has such a full personality that it's insane to think we're only 5 episodes into the season. Like, if I sat you down and asked you to describe each of the characters right now, 5 episodes in, without talking about their physical attributes, you absolutely could thoroughly and never feel redundant. They feel unique and fleshed out, and that's really where King of the Hill shines. And there's no better example than what happens next. While Hank is out looking for a new boyfriend for Luann at the dance hall, he finds the perfect guy for her and leaves knowing that she's in good hands. Turns out that real homegrown Texan was way too handsy and creeped Luann out, so who takes her home? Why, it's none other than dang old Boomhauer, man, the Glenn Quagmire of King of the Hill. And so, Hank believes one of his best friends is sleeping with Luann. The thing I love most about this is, the audience can somewhat understand Boomhauer, but no one else really can. He is very clear he has no feelings or interest in Luann at all, and was just helping her get out of a bad situation. She says she's going to stay at his place, and he says, absolutely not, I'm not doing that, and then she proceeds to do it anyway. When she is getting second thoughts about her plan that she put in motion, he literally just throws blankets and a pillow on the couch for her to sleep while he sleeps in his bed. He will do the nice and right thing, but he is not inherently skeevy. It's not like he waited until she turned 18 and then took her up to a log cabin or anything. That would be weird and really off character. That would not be a great episode and would make you rethink why you would write a character like that. Anyway, when Luann goes to pick up her stuff after she and Hank had a falling out, he tells her it's in the den, fully packed up and ready for her. And when she goes in, she sees he's transformed the den into a proper bedroom for her to live in permanently. It's been hinted at throughout the series, but Luann is with the Hills because her home life is terrible. Her parents fight when they're not in prison, and Peggy wants to do right by her niece and take care of her and give her a better life. She loves Bobby, Peggy, and Hank. She wants to succeed in beauty school, and Brittany Murphy brought a beautifully multi-layered character to life like only she could. This is really the start of Luann's journey, and it's just so amazing seeing where all this is starting from. The episode is a 10 out of 10, and does a beautiful job. Right out the gate, we see Peggy playing Boggle, which won't come up ever again. I'm pointing it out for absolutely no reason. Swearsies. What's the plot of the episode? Oh, Hank is constipated, and Peggy won't stop telling people about something that he thinks should be private. A completely reasonable argument. We also find out Dale's wife is a weather girl for one of the local news stations. On the one hand, it's great to see all of Hank's friends worried about him and offering suggestions to help him out of a tricky situation. On the other, yeah, it's totally reasonable he didn't want the world knowing about his very personal issue. Jim Cummings is a guest star in this episode, and it's just so fun to hear him. Just imagine Winnie the Pooh as your Surgeon General. It's delightful. Peggy says it's something to discuss because she doesn't want it to be something serious and is just worried about her husband's health. To be fair, Nancy chose to share his business on the news. Peggy was just trusting in a confidant. We even get a dream sequence where Peggy sees herself at Hank's funeral and doesn't want to lose her husband, who finally agrees to go see a doctor for his problem. The episode perfectly encapsulates the awkwardness of the doctor's office, and that's what makes this episode so fascinating. Like, it's based around Hank getting a rectal exam and getting into tofu alternatives to his favorite meats. The great thing about this episode is it's the definition of evergreen, and really speaks to the longevity of King of the Hill. This is an episode that could be made in any show at any time period and be relatable. It doesn't hang on relevant pop culture icons or wacky situations. It's literally just Hank being constipated, Peggy being overzealous in how she cares for him because she loves him so much she doesn't want to lose him, and the community trying to help their friend. That's it. It's such a small story, and that's when I think King of the Hill is at its strongest. Like, you know how the narrative ends. You don't need me to tell you Hank loses his colon in the 6th episode of the series. You know that doesn't happen. But it's what happens at the end of the episode that matters. Hank and Peggy are crying and hugging each other as he realizes how lucky he is to have a woman so genuinely concerned about his well-being because she doesn't want to lose him. But she also doesn't want him to stop being who he is. He admits that he'll open up more, and then, as he's no longer emotionally constipated, he runs off and returns triumphant as the family embraces in a tight hug. You can laugh at it, you can cry at it. It hits so many different notes all at once, and they're each glorious. Not once in the episode does anyone mock Hank for his problem either, which is a very important note. We'll get that with other issues he develops later in the series, but here everyone just really cares for one another. You really feel the community of the neighborhood. I mean, it's just great. That being said, yeah, the middle does run a little long, and while the doctor office scene serves a purpose, and serves that purpose well, they do tend to drag a little bit. It would probably be the first 9 out of 10 of the series, and even that is still a huge accomplishment on its own. Oh, okay. I thought we had more time. I really, truly did. Okay, there is no proper way to navigate this. I think it is a multi-layered conversation that a lot of people, probably not myself, should have. Here's where things get just a wee bit controversial. So the episode opens with a moving truck and Hank excited that he's getting new neighbors. Excited when he sees the white movers unloading the truck. However, it's revealed that it's a Laotian family moving in next door. Con, Min, and their daughter, Con Jr., aka Connie, Susa Newfoundphone. Min and Connie are both voiced by acclaimed voice actress Lauren Tom, while Con is played by Toby Huss. Now, Lauren Tom does have Asian heritage. Toby Huss is very, very white. That being said, hate me if you want, I really think Toby Huss does an outstanding job at adding nuance to Con that makes him feel like a fleshed out character and is respectful of the character's culture, while also realizing his identity as an individual. They could have gone full Mickey Rooney and Breakfast at Tiffany's if they really wanted to, but they didn't, and that's kind of the point of this episode. Con and his family are still just people trying to live their best life. Hank and the gang go over expecting him to not even know English, but Con and his family speak English fluently and are genuinely smart. And even when they're treated like they're from some mystical Orient when they lived in California for the last 20 years. They're Americans, but they're still foreign to the neighborhood. It's an episode. The Hills have Con and his family over for dinner. Min makes fun of Peggy's giant feet, then improves on her brown Betty to embarrass her at their barbecue afterwards. At that same barbecue, Con gives Hank one of the best burgers he's ever had, while Bobby and Connie let Doggy and Ladybird off their restraints so they can run together, and they eventually lose both dogs. However, Hank has no idea and thinks that Con served him dog. He then decides to get evidence that they eat dog because that's what those people do, and that's effectively the episode where it ends with Con and Hank discussing parenting techniques and how they're both against spanking, which was a very forward-thinking idea in the 90s. It's surprising seeing who Hank's father is and then learning that about him. But that's the bulk of the episode, and there's so many things I glossed over because they really just boil down to that same narrative. The neighborhood jumps to conclusions about their new neighbors until they actually spend time with them and learn how they fit in the neighborhood. And I think that's where the important difference lies. If you look at Con compared to, say, Apu from The Simpsons, you see an actually fleshed out multi-layered character compared to something more closely resembling a caricature, which does work for the Simpsons style, but it obviously had negative ramifications as time went on. You never hear Con as an insult or anything because he's not a mockery of Laotian culture. He's just Con. He's a computer engineer with manic depression and a loving family who also loves karaoke and is sarcastic to a fault. He's got a lot of layers. He's a great addition to the neighborhood, mostly because he's an outsider, and sometimes he's on Hank's sides. He'll bash Hank as a crazy redneck. A good character doesn't have to be a good person all the time. I don't know. There's speculation that Khan may not even return in the new King of the Hill project, but to take him and or his family out of the show is taking a major chunk of the cast out. They're so interwoven into the narrative at this point, and Connie is a hugely important person to Bobby. I don't know. I'm rambling, I know. I'd personally say West East Side Story is closer to an 8 or 9 out of 10, just because it drags and parts can be just a little uncomfortable to watch. Though I will say, it's the funniest Dale has been since the show began. His voice is still developing, but you can really hear Johnny Hardwick adding more and more layers. It's delightful. It's Bobby's birthday, and his grandpa Cotton is coming. Peggy calls him evil, which honestly is fair. I will say it's weird seeing Bobby not like Cotton initially, just because of what we get later on, but it is interesting. Cotton rides in on a horse, and that's our first proper appearance of the shinless Fitty-Man Killer and his wife Dee Dee, who is the same age as Hank. Cotton gets Bobby a shotgun for his birthday. I will say, Toby Huss is still getting Cotton down. He'll get more nasally as time goes on, but the core of Cotton is here. The funny thing is, Khan really doesn't change at all throughout the series. He's kind of set as he is, and that works for the character. This is truly the perfect example of a great character doesn't have to be a good person. Cotton is just the worst. Every time we see him in flashbacks, he's been wild and out there and aggressive, but we never really got to fully experience him. Now he's slapping ass and taking names, and Bobby is learning from him. Not gonna lie, it's a pretty intense episode. You've seen this idea before in all kinds of sitcoms and cartoons, and it's not a bad trope, but King of the Hill cranks it up to almost parody. Cotton is just this womanizing sleazebag that puts his son down at any given moment just because he can. He loves Bobby, but he is also just weird and grossly intense, which really works for Cotton. Anyway, Cotton mutilates his own car to stay after the birthday party, and Luann fixes it because, you know, she's good at that stuff. Cotton bashes women and their contribution to society. Bobby then gets sent home for starting a sexist chant, emphasizing what his grandfather just taught him. The episode culminates in Hank standing firm and defending Peggy while calling out his dad for being the horrible person that he is, and talks about how a good relationship needs to be 50-50. Cotton doesn't even leave defeated at that point. He smiles as he hops in the car with Dee Dee and talks about how love is weakness. I think that's the most important thing. If this were a lesser show, those messages could sound preachy. They almost sound altruistic. But if you've paid attention throughout the show, Hank and Peggy stick to those values. They genuinely trust and understand each other. Look back at Square Peg. The message of that episode literally hinges on them believing in what Hank is saying to his father. The other important factor is Cotton. He isn't even fazed by what Hank is saying, and honestly, he shouldn't be. That's his character. He is steadfast in his ways. He's a soldier that served his country and was wounded in combat, and is a totally sexist, horribly abusive father. He could take a look at Khan and immediately tell he was Laotian, and then still belittled him at every turn. He is a bad guy, but a great character, and honestly, he's probably the closest thing we have to a main antagonist in this entire show. Even as I think about it, his arc throughout the show is really kind of dark, and I am excited to go back through it. But he is the closest thing the show has to an active antagonist. If he is around, no one is getting along. He is the perfect foil to Hank, who is steadfast in his honest ways, and while he isn't a show-off, he's earned the respect and admiration of his friends and family, which is just incredible. Talk about the inactive rebellion there. And again, huge shout out to Toby Huss for making Cotton so unlikable. His voice will change as the series goes on, but that cadence is still just so biting, it's great. The episode has a lot to love and a lot to justifiably hate. I can see a lot of people just straight up hating everything about it, but I implore you to look at it from a writing and performance perspective. You feel something because it's so well done. Even if it evoked hatred from you, it's because it was trying to, and that takes real talent. It's an absolutely solid 8 out of 10 that does have one scene too many, but was an overall great first clash between Hank and Cotton. I need to go to the Dallas Mower Expo, Sunday, Sunday, Sunday. Like, sure, the 8 story and whatnot, but that commercial is something I still think about to this day. King Mulch is an icon. What does that thing do? Anyway, Peggy is a frighteningly good Boggle player, and I can't emphasize enough how Boggle tournaments were a pretty big deal back in the day alongside Scrabble. It was the 90s. There was a lot of niche culture to pass the time before YouTube and home entertainment were more readily accessible. As someone that's gone to their fair share of LCSs, it's a community thing. And I don't know, I have always been a fan of this episode, mostly because my own grandmother was an active, avid Boggle tournament player and staunch Scrabble player. She got me a dictionary so I'd have a fighting chance against her. That's how serious things were in my house. We would play the 5-letter word game for fun on road trips. We were those people. You think I want to know how many points X is worth in Scrabble? 8. Same as J. Anyway, Peggy wins her first Boggle trophy, and Hank gets self-conscious when Peggy gets to go to the state championship. Hank gets to go to the Mower Expo in Dallas while Peggy competes, all while Bobby and Luann hang out and watch some rentals from Blockbuster. I'm not going to explain rentals from Blockbuster, but no, it was a pretty great time. Laurie Metcalf guest stars as Cece Cobb, the Boggle champ of Dallas, which is right at the end of Roseanne, so she was a pretty big get for the show. Bobby and Luann start to spiral and freak out as the house falls into disrepair with a drop of varnish on the carpet, and it just gets worse from there. Peggy needs Hank as her coach, and he looks for every chance to sneak away, while Peggy panics and can't focus during the tournament. I love the Hank and the gang bits at the Lawnmower Expo, but this episode felt the most gaggy of the season. There was more drastic cuts than we'd seen before, and it felt like they were padding the episode with quick jokes, which just hasn't been King of the Hill style up to this point, or would be going forward. It's a weird episode that is sort of the exception to the rule that King of the Hill doesn't do slap jokes. It comes back around when Peggy makes it to the finals. Hank realizes he needs to do the right thing and goes to be by his wife's side and gives her the pencil that allows her to win the game. Laurie Metcalf really brings it as Cece, and I mean, she really is the breakout guest star right out the gate. Just absolutely stellar job making such an easily hateable character. The other great thing is Peggy is shown not needing any actual coaching, she just needed his support by being there. Hank isn't her key to victory or a lucky charm, he is literally just her support. But even when they get back and see the cleaning crew, it just feels out of place. It's not a bad episode by any means, it's still really funny and has a lot of charm. It's probably around a 9 out of 10 overall, and a great way to turn the corner on the end of the first season. Bobby is caught trying to smoke with Joseph by Hank. We then learn that Hank and Peggy used to smoke, so to teach Bobby a lesson, Hank makes him smoke a carton all in one sitting. Hank then tries to show Bobby how to smoke like an American and starts smoking again. Dale starts helping Joseph make an informed decision on smoking. It's definitely one of the more artistic episodes. There's a lot of play with angles and even has this weird aerial shot when both Bobby and Hank light up as they both struggle with their addictions. It's a weird episode, but it does show Hank has some vices and isn't a perfect guy. He's just an everyman, and that's okay. It's also kind of funny that the first Strickland propane worker we meet is actually Enrique, and he's not played by Danny Trejo like he would be later in the series, but is actually played by Eloy Casados, and it's fun. They take a smoke break at a propane shop, and what could possibly go wrong? There's a C story about Luann trying to get Lady Bird to stop eating all of her makeup, which actually has a payoff at the end of the episode. And this is kind of the best way to explain King of the Hill to anyone. It's practical absurdity. It's all wacky stories that could realistically happen. However, I think they're elevated by their animation, especially this episode, whereas Hank, Peggy, and Bobby get more and more addicted and start slipping down Sweet Lady Nicotine's slide of seduction, their designs also start to contort. They look more and more disheveled, and not just in their clothes, in their actual line work and expressions. It's actually wonderful that Luann is the voice of reason that tries to train them like dogs when nothing else works. She's come from a broken family, and she doesn't want to see that happening to the Hills too. Keeping Up with Our Joneses is the episode I'd show a Beavis and Butthead fan to convert them to the show. It feels like it is the most Mike Judge influence of the season, from the jokes to just the overall tone. We also get more of Pathetic Bill, which will be played up as the series goes on, but it's great that we've been getting sprinkles of the rest of the gang. Keeping Up is a 7 out of 10 that feels like a whirlwind that sweeps you up and sets you down and tells you totally watched an episode of King of the Hill, don't worry about it. I think knowing this episode was in this season was why I avoided the season as a whole, just because the second half spirals so fast. It's a good episode still, don't get me wrong, I honestly probably appreciate it more this watch through than previously, just probably the weakest narratively of the season. That being said, it is super experimental and does have a lot to appreciate. Again, for late 90s animation, there's so many shots that make you just take a step back and appreciate the cells and layering. I know it's a weird thing to nerd out over, but just seeing the smoke that isn't just edited in post is so refreshing. It's like the smoke monster from Ferngully. There's a charm to animation from this time period, especially King of the Hill, that I wish more people appreciated. Hank is trimming up his lawn to make sure it's looking as good as possible to impress at the block party as Con gloats about how superior his lawn is to Hank's. It's actually a Dale episode, believe it or not. Peggy thinks Dale spraying poison on Hank's lawn is what's causing it to fail. You really can't argue with that logic, and so yeah, Hank tells Dale to not spray and they get into it. This is when we find out Dale is a poison man. He's an exterminator with a love for the job, just not a competency for it. Dale does not take it well. He then decides to plant fire ants on Hank's lawn to sabotage him for having a problem with him spraying his poison. Bobby and Joseph take a queen and the other ants and put them in a gumball machine where Bobby thinks he can understand the queen's pheromones and follows her orders. Dale starts inching Hank out as an authority because he can't maintain his lawn. Hank apologizes to Dale, who then decides to fix everything by spraying his strongest poison and killing his lawn. Bobby really gets obsessed with the queen ant while Hank sinks into the mud that was his lawn in shock. Peggy finds Dale's plans to sabotage and he approaches her like he's Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs. Bobby, okay, let's talk about it. He might be Buddha. He gets real obsessed with the ant and even releases the queen before getting swarmed and just covered in fire ants. Hank finds out Dale did in fact destroy his lawn, and he runs after him only to have Dale take the fire ants off Bobby as punishment for what he did and to save the boy. You still following along, gang? Yeah, it's a lot happening all at once, especially on Dale's first real time in the spotlight. Hank and Dale make up, and while Hank wallows without his lawn, the whole neighborhood, including Con, which is important, come together to give Hank a piece of their own lawns to give him something to grow back with. They talk about what a kind person Hank is and the community he's made out of a neighborhood as they all come together to help him in his time of need. King of the Ant Hill is our first real taste of Dale as a character, and man, I'm so glad he doesn't change. Throughout the series, this is Dale. He's always going to be this squirrely, conspiracy-driven little goblin man, and that's why he was such a fan favorite. Some of my favorite episodes are Dale episodes, and it's very easy to see why. He always keeps Rainy Street exciting. I really don't know what was going on with Bobby and the ants. Maybe he could just talk to him. Who knows? It was just really bizarre. And it's great listening to Peggy talk about Spanish as a substitute Spanish teacher and not being exactly right. I mean, this season has been a knockout hit, and with only one more episode to go, it's hard to see it falling at all. King of the Ant Hill is a terrific 9 out of 10. Bobby gets invited to his first boy-girl party by Joseph. Luann has to get ready for her final at beauty school. Her teacher, Miss Kremser, is actually played by award-winning actress Jennifer Coolidge, which, wow, 25 years of quality. Keep going. Dawn Lewis plays Sharona, a fellow beauty school student. Bobby starts to panic about not knowing how to interact with girls and starts to have a psychotic break until Connie pulls him out of it. He thinks he's not into girls and even wants to pull out of going to Joseph's party until Luann comes home with a practice doll head to practice styling on, and Bobby is absolutely infatuated and starts using it to practice talking to and kissing girls. And yeah, he bars the door so he can dance with a head. It reminds me of Lars and the Real Girl, which I believe they made after seeing this episode. It just lines up is all I'm saying. Ryan Gosling would make an excellent live-action Hank Hill now. This is actually our first time seeing Bill as a military barber, and he offers for Luann to practice cuts on the recruits since they have to have their heads shaved anyway. If you're unnerved by the doll head and how Bobby interacts with it, hey, that's the point. King of the Hill handles the awkwardness of adolescence like only it can. It's weird, it's unsettling, but it's perfectly on brand for Bobby to be this weird, and using the doll head does give him the confidence to be able to just be natural around girls. I mean, not last episode, he was mouth-feeding ants sugar. It's just this is the first season finale. Imagine you were invested in this show, and for 3 months you've loved every bit of your adventures with Hill House, and then bam, the last episode is Bobby dealing with his infatuation with the doll head. If Keeping Up with Our Joneses wasn't earlier in the series, I think this might have been too jarring, but having that buffer lets this episode be so out there. However, in Hank's blind rage, he slices Luann's practice doll in half, so she has to use him as a model. Thankfully, he helps her pass by complimenting her hard work, and it actually feels like a proper point of progression in Luann's journey. She's earned the respect of her peers and her teacher, and has shown through hard work even she can keep climbing. She even has her teacher apologize for being too harsh on her, which is fantastic. It shows growth. She has really come into her own as a character. She is not just the idiot of Hill House. Anyway, after Peggy sends Bobby to the party, he runs into Connie, and they share their first kisses together. At the party, Bobby lunges to kiss Nancy when Spin the Bottle gets way out of hand, and that's the last shot of the entire season. That is how you stay in people's heads and make them keep thinking about the show no matter what. Plastic White Female is very much a benchmark episode. Nothing is the same afterwards, and it really showcases how far the show has come in just 12 episodes. Luann is fully moved in and working her way through beauty school. Bobby has a new friend and confidant in Connie, who he has shared his first kiss with. The show can only go up from here, and the characters showcased have already had such massive growth. It's a solid 8 out of 10 episode that cements season 1 as one of the best seasons of the entire show. And there we have it, folks. That's season 1. Anything you think I was wrong on? Right on? What was your favorite episode? Least favorite? Let me know in the comments below. And if you liked what you saw, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell your friends we're out here. Honestly, I have been doing myself a disservice by skipping season 1 in my rewatches, and this review has only made me appreciate this classic more. It's funny that a show that came out 8 years before American Dad can still have a much more solid first season by a mile. Again, I'd love to see what Mike Judge had come up with without Greg Daniels' input, since I'm sure it would be unhinged in the best way. But there is so much heart in this series, it really can't be envisioned any other way than it is. This cartoon has better written characters than some HBO shows, and it isn't afraid of letting the characters carry the episodes instead of the wacky situations they get into. Outside of Hank's Got the Willies, each episode felt largely believable, and you could even envision how it would be shot as a live-action series. King of the Hill is familiar, and the characters aren't intended to look grotesque or like their parodies. They're supposed to look like normal humans, and they by and far do a pretty good job of doing that. King of the Hill is a special series that never goes for the big uproarious jokes, but you always walk away feeling content in what you watched. It knows how to pull on your heartstrings while establishing the trust to let them do what they're doing. If this is the first season, I'm honestly excited to dive right back in, though it's unfortunate what's going to happen to Peggy's character and Luann's. Anyway, that's gonna do it for season 1. So sorry for the wait on this video, but now that we're up and running again, we're gonna get right back on track. Thank you all so much for checking out this new venture. The algorithm has gotta pick us up eventually. Stay strong, keep fighting, and know I always believe in you. And I'll see you all next time, since there's much ado about season 2. Goodbye, everybody.